On July 29, 1944, Adolf Hitler personally authorizes the Iron Cross Second Class, Nazi Germany's mark of supreme military honor, for one of his most trusted intelligence assets in Britain. 4 months later, in near total secrecy, King George VI signs off on a member of the Order of the British Empire for the very same man. 2 mortal enemies, 2 of the highest honors either nation can bestow, one man. He never fired a weapon. He never crossed a battlefield. He built his war out of paper, ink, and invention. And for 3 years he fed Adolf Hitler a version of reality that did not exist. His name was Juan Pujol García. The Germans called him Alaric. The British called him Garbo. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, the fate of the Normandy invasion rested almost entirely on how completely he had convinced Berlin to trust him. By the time the first landing craft reached the beaches, Pujol had spent 2 years constructing something that existed nowhere except in his own imagination and on index cards in a quiet London suburb, a spy network of 27 agents operating across Britain. Not one of them was real. And yet the German High Command trusted this network so completely that 3 days after D-Day, acting on Pujol's word, Hitler personally ordered an entire army to stand still, while Allied troops fought for their lives on the beachhead below. To understand how a single Spanish civilian came to hold that kind of power over the German war machine, you have to go back to a man who at the start of the war could not get either side to take him seriously. Pujol had no military background worth mentioning. He trained as a poultry farmer. He managed a small cinema for a while. Then Spain tore itself apart in civil war, and he watched both sides commit atrocities in the name of causes he didn't believe in. He deserted the nationalist army rather than keep fighting. What he carried out of those years wasn't loyalty to any side. It was a hatred of totalitarianism, fascist or communist, and a conviction that he personally had to do something about Hitler. So in January 1941, Pujol walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy. They turned him down. Then they turned him down again. Then a third time. Most people would have given up there. Pujol did something almost nobody would think to try. If the British wouldn't recruit him, he would force their hand by becoming a German spy first. He approached the Abwehr, Nazi military intelligence, in Madrid, playing a fanatically pro-Nazi Spanish official with travel access to Britain. It worked. The Germans recruited him, handed him a codebook and invisible ink, gave him £600, and christened him Alaric. There was just one problem. Pujol had never been to Britain. He didn't speak English, and he had no intention of ever actually operating inside the country he'd just agreed to infiltrate. Instead, he moved to neutral Lisbon and built his entire espionage career out of a Portuguese public library. Using a tourist guidebook, a map, railway timetables, and old British newspapers, Pujol began inventing an entire network of sub-agents he claimed were operating across the UK, a Welsh fascist sympathizer, a Gibraltarian waiter picking up gossip inside a British military canteen, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow. None of them existed. All of them, according to his reports, were feeding Berlin a steady stream of British secrets. The gaps in his knowledge were glaring. In one report, he claimed dock workers in Glasgow would do anything for a liter of wine, seemingly unaware that Scotland's drinking culture ran to whiskey, not wine, or that Britain didn't even use the metric system. It should have been an obvious tell. It wasn't. The Abwehr wanted to believe him. That detail says something important about the intelligence culture Pujol was exploiting. His handler in Madrid, a major named Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, had every institutional incentive to reward volume over verification, and, as later research revealed, deeply personal reasons of his own for wanting Pujol's network to be real. We'll come back to that. For now, what matters is this. Pujol's fabricated reports were convincing enough that they started causing chaos for the British. In February 1942, codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted Abwehr radio traffic, referencing a well-placed, highly trusted German agent inside Britain, operating under the name Arabelle. MI5 didn't know who Arabelle was. They only knew that someone was apparently running rings around British counterintelligence from inside their own borders, with information specific enough and wrong enough to trigger a full-scale spy hunt. They were hunting for a man who had never set foot in the country. The mystery broke from an unexpected direction. Pujol's wife, Araceli, made contact with the American naval attaché in Lisbon and told him something close to the truth. Her husband was the phantom agent quietly driving both German and British intelligence to distraction. MI6 sent an officer to interview him. Word reached MI5. In April 1942, Pujol was smuggled through Gibraltar into Plymouth, and Britain finally had, sitting in a debriefing room, the spy they had spent months hunting. They gave him a new code name, Garbo, because, as one officer put it, he was simply the finest actor they had ever encountered. What happened next turned a lucky improviser into a weapon. MI5 paired Pujol with Tomas Harris, a bilingual art dealer turned intelligence officer whose real talent was structure, the kind of obsessive cross-referenced record-keeping that could keep 27 invented personalities from ever contradicting one another. Harris built the architecture, Pujol supplied the voice. Together, from a modest safe house at 35 Crespigny Road in Hendon, the two men expanded the spinninets, the spider's web, into a fully operational deception machine, feeding Madrid a careful blend of real, low-value intelligence and calculated fiction, always engineered to reinforce Pujol's credibility. Exactly how much of that credibility belonged to Pujol and how much to Harris is still debated by historians. Early accounts cast Pujol as a lone improvisational genius. More recent work through declassified MI5 files points toward something closer to a true partnership. Pujol supplying the restless imagination that made 27 invented lives feel distinct and human. Harris supplying the rigid military logic that made their reports plausible enough for Schaeff to build real strategy around. Neither man, on his own, likely could have sustained the fiction for as long as they did. The invented agents themselves range from the mundane to the absurd. One sub-agent was supposedly the leader of a Welsh fascist group called the World Aryan Order. Another was described as an Indian nationalist poet who despised British rule. None of it was ever meant to be checked closely, and for years, nobody did. In November 1942, that credibility faced its first serious test. The Allies were preparing to invade North Africa, and MI5 allowed Pujol to send Madrid an entirely accurate report, the true departure of the invasion fleet from Scottish ports. Then they deliberately delayed the letter in the post. It arrived in Madrid hours after the landings had already begun, useless as a warning, but perfect as proof. Garbo's information had been completely correct. Its lateness clearly wasn't his fault. The Abwehr blamed the mail service. Garbo's reputation, paradoxically, came out of the episode stronger than ever. The system wasn't foolproof, though. When British forces made an unreported naval movement out of Liverpool that one of Pujol's fictional agents should logically have caught, he needed an explanation for the silence. His solution? He killed the agent off. Sub-Agent 2, William Gerbers, fell suddenly ill and died. MI5 even planted a fake obituary in a local paper to sell the lie. convincingly enough that the Abwehr began paying a pension to Goebbels' non-existent widow. By 1944, this fictional intelligence empire had grown so trusted that Germany had funneled the modern equivalent of several $1 million into funding a network that existed only on paper. It's worth returning now to Kühlenthal, the Abwehr officer who had recruited Pujol in Madrid and continued championing his reports for 3 straight years. His blind faith wasn't simple carelessness. Kühlenthal had a Jewish grandmother, which under Nazi racial law made him a Mischling, a classification that put his career and quite possibly his family's safety in constant jeopardy. He survived only because Abwehr Chief Wilhelm Canaris personally secured him a special exemption, an Aryan certificate. A man in that position had every incentive to make himself indispensable to Berlin, and nothing did that better than an apparently brilliant spy network he alone had discovered. He needed Garbo to be real. That need turned him into one of the most reliable unwitting instruments the British ever operated inside German intelligence. But the operation's greatest danger in these years never came from German counterintelligence. It came from inside the Hendon safe house. Araceli had been essential to getting Pujol recruited in the first place. It was her nerve in Lisbon that finally forced British intelligence to listen. But in London, MI5 kept her almost entirely isolated, forbidden from socializing with other Spaniards for fear of a security leak. She spoke little English. She missed her family. MI5 tried, in small and slightly absurd ways, to manage her unhappiness. At one point, they dispatched an officer all the way to Lisbon for the sole purpose of buying her 12 pairs of silk stockings, a luxury nowhere to be found in rationed wartime Britain. It bought them very little time. By June of 1943, the isolation had become unbearable. On June 21st, she called Harris and told him she was finished, that she would go to the Spanish embassy and expose the entire operation, whatever it cost. It was a threat that could have unraveled 2 years of work overnight. At the exact moment Allied planners were beginning to build the deception that would one day need to cover an invasion of France itself. MI5's answer was ruthless. Harris told Araceli that her outburst had led to her husband's arrest as a security risk. She was driven blindfolded to Camp 020, Latchmere House, MI5's grim interrogation facility, and shown Pujol, unshaven, in prison clothes. Believing she had put him in mortal danger, she broke down and signed a pledge never to approach the embassy again. It worked, but it's worth sitting with what that means. The operation that helped make D-Day possible survived not because British intelligence outwitted the Gestapo, but because they staged the arrest of their own agent to frighten his wife into silence. With the marriage crisis contained, the operation entered its most consequential phase. Allied planners were preparing the invasion of Normandy, and they needed the Germans to believe the real target lay elsewhere. At the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point from Britain, and the location German planners already assumed made the most tactical sense. The plan needed a phantom army. Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways, brought in to overhaul the deception, scrapped an earlier version he considered too flimsy and rebuilt it around something more convincing: the real, unassigned headquarters of the 1st United States Army Group, padded with a mix of genuine and invented divisions, and placed on paper under the command of General George Patton, a name German intelligence took very seriously. Strangeways' team gave the fiction a body: inflatable rubber tanks, plywood and canvas landing craft, fabricated radio traffic engineered to sound like a massing invasion force. Soldiers were even sent into pubs near the phantom camps wearing the wrong unit insignia simply to seed rumors. Garbo's job was to give all of it a voice. From January to May 1944, Pujol and Harris sent Madrid more than 500 messages reporting troop movements, supply buildups, and Patton's presence in southeastern England, an invasion force made almost entirely of rubber, plywood, and paper, described in exhaustive, credible detail. Then came June 6th. To protect Garbo's cover for what was coming next, MI5 authorized him to warn the Germans about Normandy, but only once it was too late to matter. At 3 in the morning, hours before the first landing craft reached the beaches, Pujol sat at his transmitter and began sending an urgent warning to Madrid. No one answered. For 5 hours, the line stayed silent, the German radio operators, off duty, asleep through the most important message their agent had ever tried to send them. By the time contact resumed at 8 a.m., Allied troops were already fighting on French soil. Pujol didn't apologize for the delay. He was furious that no one had been listening, and he let his handlers know it in no uncertain terms. Rather than losing patience with him, the Abwehr apologized. A near-catastrophic failure in tradecraft became, in German eyes, further proof of his unimpeachable loyalty. 3 days later came the moment the entire operation had been built toward. With Allied forces clinging to a narrow beachhead, German commanders were debating whether to send the powerful 15th Army, still waiting at the Pas de Calais, south to crush them. It was, historians agree, a moment when a decisive counterattack might genuinely have pushed the invasion back into the sea. On June 9th, Garbo transmitted a report insisting Normandy was a diversion, a feint meant to draw German reserves away from the real invasion still to come at Calais under Patton's command. Hitler read the report. So did Colonel Alexis von Roena, the German officer responsible for estimating Allied strength in Britain, who had already told Berlin the Allies had something close to 90 divisions in England, more than double the true number. Believing a larger force was still waiting to strike, Hitler personally ordered the 15th Army to hold its position at Calais. It stayed there for 7 weeks. Here the story gets more complicated. Von Roena was no Nazi loyalist. He was a devout, aristocratic officer who privately despised Hitler's regime, and he would later be executed for his peripheral role in the July 1944 plot against Hitler's life. Historians still debate whether his wildly inflated troop estimates were an honest analytical failure, fed by the sheer volume of double-cross disinformation, or a deliberate act of sabotage from within a regime he hated. The evidence doesn't settle the question. What it does confirm is that his numbers, whatever his motives, helped convince Hitler to keep an army frozen in place while the invasion he might have crushed took root. By the time German commanders understood the truth, that the first U.S. Army group didn't exist, that Normandy wasn't a diversion, Allied forces had broken out of the Normandy bocage and were driving toward Paris. 7 weeks. Roughly 150,000 German troops held in place by a network of 27 people who had never existed, corroborated by an army of rubber tanks and empty radio chatter. Germany, in the end, had paid for the privilege. Records later showed the Abwehr had funneled the modern equivalent of several $1 million into Pujol's network over the course of the war, financing unknowingly one of the most consequential deceptions ever run against them. The case didn't just win a battle, it rewrote a rulebook. What the Garbo operation proved beyond doubt was that turning an enemy agent was worth immeasurably more than catching or killing one. That lesson, patient, bureaucratic, built on index cards rather than gunfire, became a founding principle of Western counterintelligence doctrine for decades of Cold War espionage that followed. 3 weeks after D-Day, Berlin radioed Pujol to tell him Hitler had personally approved his Iron Cross. In November, King George VI secretly signed off on his MBE. No ceremony, no public record, just two governments on opposite sides of the war, agreeing for entirely different reasons, that this man deserved their highest thanks. Thomas Harris, the man who had turned Pujol's imagination into a functioning intelligence weapon, returned to art dealing after the war. He died in a car accident in Mallorca in 1964, a death that later fed unproven rumors about Soviet connections through his old friend Kim Philby, rumors no declassified file has ever confirmed. Araceli's story ended even more quietly. She separated from Pujol after the war, returned to Madrid, and built a new life running a respected art gallery, married to a former Hollywood stand-in for Rudolph Valentino. For nearly 40 years, she never told anyone, including for a long time her own children, what she had done to help win the war, and Pujol himself simply disappeared. Fearing reprisals from Nazi sympathizers who might one day learn the truth, MI5 helped him fake his own death from malaria in Angola in 1949. He resurfaced in Venezuela under a different life, teaching English for an oil company and running a small bookstore, while the man who had once outmaneuvered the Third Reich lived by every official record as someone who no longer existed. He stayed that way for 35 years. In 1984, a British intelligence writer named Nigel West set out to track him down, working from little more than a hunch in a Barcelona phone book, calling every listed Garcia until one call reached the right family. Pujol's own children, who had grown up believing their father was dead, learned that morning that he was alive. He flew back to Europe that year. He was received privately at Buckingham Palace by Prince Philip. He walked the beaches at Normandy on the 40th anniversary of the landings, an old man standing on ground he had helped make survivable for soldiers he had never met and never fired a shot to protect. Juan Pujol García died in Caracas in 1988 at 74. He remains the only individual known to have been decorated by both Adolf Hitler and the British Crown, not for anything he took by force, but for what he built from nothing. 27 people who never lived, and a version of reality so complete that, for 7 critical weeks in the summer of 1944, it was the only one the German High Command believed.